Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today we're going to talk about Iron Claw, the movie centering the Von Erich family. It was released in 2023 around Christmas. Finally got to see it. Now we're going to talk about it. So we're going to talk about the film. We're going to talk about the acting. And of course, I'm not going to really go too much into the historical inaccuracies because what's the point? It's a movie. It's not meant to be a documentary. So we're going to go through it. First, let's start with overall thoughts. Overall, I thought the movie was pretty good. I liked the acting. I liked the wrestling was actually pretty well done. The pacing of the movie was kind of slow, but it was meant to be dramatic. It was also a negative because when it comes to the pacing, this movie takes place over the course of about 12 or 13 years, between 1979 to like 1992, 1993, thereabouts. And because so much time is covered, they don't give you an idea of when time is changing. So that's one of my criticisms of the movie is it starts out in 1979, but you don't know when it becomes 1984, unless you have a working history of the Von Erich family, David died in 1984, so we're in 1984 right now. So it requires you to somewhat have a working history of the Von Erich family, the NWA championship, etc., because they don't fill you in on when the year is changing. So you're not knowing what's going on, but if you're just watching this thing, you're basically looking at this all happening over the course of a couple of years. Maybe you see the children have grown up. So you figure let's estimate how old the kids are so we can figure out what year we're in. So that's the problem. And I'm looking at it from the perspective also from somebody who doesn't know anything. So if you don't know anything about the Von Erichs, you don't know what year any of this stuff happened. Okay? You can tell time is moving forward clearly, but they don't give you 1984, 1986, 1991, whatever, because these are important moments. Now, in terms of the acting, I enjoyed the acting. Some of it was a little dry, but I did like the acting. I specifically really liked Fritz. The guy who played Fritz was absolutely perfect. He looked like him. He acted like him. Sounded like him. A less aggressive Fritz. Now, I was concerned when this movie was going to be released if they were going to be historically accurate with Fritz. From all the stories that you may have heard or read about Fritz, what are they going to be accurate? And they toned Fritz down actually a little bit. They didn't make him completely unlikable, but it was clear that you weren't supposed to like him. And from the tempo of the movie, they weren't subtle about Fritz pushing the boys into wrestling. They were subtle about Fritz picking favorites, even though he openly pits favorites in one scene. But they very subtly show how Fritz is overlooking Kevin, or Fritz is just moving forward, not giving them any time to grieve or any time to get over it. But he's positioned as being sort of the typically toxic masculine character, specifically at the funeral. I believe it was David's funeral, where he made Carrie and Mike remove their sunglasses. He didn't want them to hide their faces, and they better not cry because he doesn't want any tears. And then this is juxtaposed later in the movie with Kevin Von Erich is crying openly as he watches his sons play in front of him, and he's openly crying, and he tells his sons, men aren't supposed to cry. And then the boys are like, "It's okay, Daddy, you can cry." It's like, I noticed that. And it's one of the working feminist ideas about masculinity that men can't handle significant amounts of pressure. Therefore, they break down and kill themselves instead of talking things out, instead of crying, showing emotion, showing vulnerability, showing weakness. But at the same time, this movie has a lot of the vulnerability in it because they're trying to get you invested in the relationship specifically Kevin has with all of his brothers. And because of that, the element of well, guys can't be vulnerable around each other, that does not work. Because you see Kevin being very vulnerable. He's being very protective of his brothers. He's being a guy who can, they can show weakness to. He could talk to them. There's scenes where, he's talking with David, and openly he's telling David, because David is throwing up blood, I don't want you to go to Japan. I feel bad. And, I got a bad feeling about this. And David kind of laughs it off and is like, man, I'll be okay. So it gives you the vulnerable man and Kevin telling his brother, hey, man, I love you guys. I want you to take care of yourself. Might not want to make that trip. And then the typically masculine guy, David, is like, I got it. I got this. And he goes over to Japan and dies. And then the same thing where Mike Von Erich, he's showing some vulnerability with his mom, where he says that everybody wants him to be David. He's not David. Then a couple of scenes later, he kills himself. Then you have Carrie. He shows some vulnerability with Kevin. He calls Kevin on the phone. He expresses how he's in pain constantly after losing his foot, that, things are not working out. He's out of control. His behavior is out of control. The WWF only has him working house shows. They're not going to renew his contract. They don't want him anymore. And he wants to die. And he literally uses those words, I want to die. I want to kill myself or whatever. And then Kevin gets Fritz, and they go and get Carrie. But then because they're not watching him, he goes away and kills himself. So the idea that men can't handle pressure and they don't verbalize things, they internalize them, and then they explode in either rage against somebody else or rage against themselves, doesn't really work in this movie, because there is so much male vulnerability, specifically in the younger Von Erichs. Not so much in Fritz. You don't even see Fritz cry in this movie, despite all the death and the sadness. You compare that to the mom, who is worn down as this thing goes on. She actually becomes more and more detached. But that's sort of the story of the mom anyway, is that she's there, she's present, but she's mostly passive. She, pushes the boys away. There's a situation in which there's a conversation. It's between Mike and Fritz. It's over, I think, breakfast or something to that effect. And Fritz is criticizing Mike for being too skinny, saying that basically he'll never be a wrestler because he's too skinny. He's got to put on some weight. He's got to hit gym. And he's comparing Mike to David. He's comparing Mike to Carrie. He's comparing Mike to Kevin. Carrie's about to be an Olympian. He's, strong, and your brothers are wrestlers. They're strong. You got to be strong too. Kevin doesn't agree with this. After he has some pushback to Fritz, some very little pushback, Fritz basically tells him, get out of here. We got this. He goes to his mom, and his mom is very distant. She's in the mirror doing her makeup or whatever. Kevin wants to talk to her, and I remember I think the dialogue literally is, Mom, I need to talk to you. And she says, what for? Go talk to your brothers. That's what they're there for. And then she's like, oh, it's about Dad. And, he's picking on Mike. Maybe Mike doesn't want to be a wrestler or whatever the conversation was. And she says, well, that's between them. And that's kind of how she is in the movie, where things happen, but she's always off to the side. She's cold. She's distant. She's, barely present. She's there physically, but in terms of emotional, she's not really there. She is a mother who does not protect her sons from the overbearing father. Instead, it is left to Kevin, who tries to do some pushback against Fritz, while also trying to get Fritz's attention. That's another important thing too, and I actually like that part of the movie because it felt very real. In terms of, at the beginning of the movie, Fritz is all about Kevin. Kevin is going to be the world champion. He books Kevin against Harley Race. He really believes in Kevin. Kevin wrestles Harley Race. He gets a suplex on the floor or something to that effect. He's a little slow getting up because he legitimately got injured. After the match, Fritz, again, distant dad, cold dad. You're a little slow getting up, son. He had put it in Kevin's mind that if he performed up to, a good enough standard that the NWA would give him a rematch, give him another shot at Harley Race for the title. And then Fritz just kind of moves on after seeing the performance and hearing Kevin talk, and Kevin can't cut promo. So again, that's another thing that you have to be a wrestling fan to understand is as they're telling you the story, Kevin physically can't keep up with Harley Race. He also can't cut promos. He's not a strong enough promo. So then Fritz moves on to David. And then they show you basically how he skips over Kevin and Kevin's response to it, that he's upset because he thought he was the golden boy, but Fritz has now changed his mind, and now David's the golden boy because David can talk. David has more charisma, but then David goes off and dies. So from there, he goes and has the conversation at the funeral, and they made sure to do it at the funeral, which was very interesting to show you that Fritz's mind does not leave wrestling. That even after burying his son, his mind is still on wrestling. His mind is still on the World Heavyweight Championship, which he feels has been robbed from him. And he says, one of you guys got to step up. And Kevin volunteers to do it, but then Kerry also wants to do it. And then they start to have a little bit of an argument about it. And then they do a coin flip, quote unquote. And Kerry ends up getting the title. And Kevin is happy for his brother, but also disappointed that it wasn't him. And that's an interesting story as you watch the movie go forward, that Kevin's in the position that he is there to elevate his brothers. Once he fails and he doesn't get his shot, he can't be jealous. He can't have that opportunity of being jealous. He has to lift his brothers up. So I dig that. I like that story. I like that element. And it actually humanized Kevin quite a bit because he's not the guy who's constantly standing up to Fritz. He is the guy who also wants Fritz's approval. He wants what Fritz wants, but he waffles here and there. For instance, he goes on a date with the woman who becomes his wife, and she says, "What do you want to do?" And he says, "I want to be World Heavyweight Champion." And then later on, he's talking to David one-on-one, and David is sick, and he's throwing up and everything. And he tells David, "I really don't care about being world champ. I just want to hang out with you guys." And it's like, you can tell that Fritz moving on from him changed his perspective on it. That he wanted the title when Fritz wanted him to be the champion. But then once it became about David, he had to release himself of that jealousy and say, it's not about what I want. I just want to hang out with my brothers, And I like that progression. And it's a little bit of a contradiction, but contradiction is human. Time had changed. That's why I say it should have been important. They should have noted that, this was in 1980, whatever, and then this is 1984. 2 or 3 years or whatever has passed. Kevin's in a different place in his career. David's in a different place in his career. They're different people. Kevin has grown up. He's about to have a family. Maybe being the world champion is not that important anymore because now, he's about to have a baby. He needs to be home more. He can't go out and run around and be world champion or whatever. And that's an interesting thing that they could have done. So I liked that growth in Kevin. And of course, it leads to Kevin attacking Fritz at the end of the movie because he didn't protect Kerry, which is probably one of the most fantastical elements of the movie is Kevin choking Fritz. I mean, come on. Nobody believes that. But this movie is told from the perspective of Kevin as the last surviving Von Erich. He's the steward of everybody's story. So, of course, he's going to be, a little bit different. But I liked how they worked Kevin's story. Mike's story is the most interesting because Mike is the guy I know the least about, him and Chris. Of course, Chris Von Erich is not in the movie. Chris Von Erich is the younger brother of Mike, and he ended up killing himself too because he was not a good pro wrestler and felt that he was besmirching the Von Erich name. But Mike Von Erich in the movie is positioned as being sort of the sensitive brother. He's not physically as big as his other brothers are. He's more into music, not that much into wrestling. He's not really pushed into wrestling, but only his brothers care about his music career. So there's a scene where Mike wants to go do a gig, and it's at a college frat party or something to that effect. This is the only time in the movie where the mom steps up and does anything. Where she says, "No, you are too young to be on a college campus. No way." And the boys basically sneak Mike away so Mike can play guitar and sing at this college party. And you get that he had a genuine love for music, not so much for wrestling. And so it was really sad when he is in the ring with Kevin and Kevin is yelling at him like, because Kevin is his trainer now. Again, they moved on. They moved beyond Kevin. And Kerry is a disaster at this point. He's into drugs and alcohol and all that kind of stuff. So Mike is the only one left. And Kevin has to train him. And he's tough on Mike. He's pushing Mike more. He's telling him to tighten up. He's yelling at him. And Mike goes out there. He does his best and he injures himself. And then, of course, they do the shoulder surgery. He gets toxic shock syndrome, fries his brain. They recreated the press conference with Mike and his fried brain. He's sitting there and he's in a daze, and it was really sad. And then the conversation happens where they're talking about Mike wrestling again, and they really pushing Mike to wrestle again. Mike's going to make his big return. Don't worry about it. Mike is sitting there in a complete daze, just completely out of it. Physically not up to the task, mentally not up to the task. He has a conversation with his mom where he says that he thinks everybody wants him to be David, and he's not David. Then he goes to his room. He plays his guitar. On the walls, you see pictures of like 80s bands like Rush and all this kind of stuff. And he's very sad. He's very out of it. And he's never going to be to the level of David or Kerry or anybody else. So he gets pills. He takes all the pills, drinks I think a Coca-Cola or something afterwards, goes to sleep and dies. And it's very, very sad. And they tell you that Mike Von Erich was not meant to be a wrestler, that he was meant for something else. But through the peer pressure or through the desire of Fritz, who is basically living vicariously through his sons, which, is the story of the movie from the very beginning, is Fritz wants to be world champion. And now he's imposing this upon his sons. Mike falls victim to that. He cannot make his dad's dreams come true. And he cannot be the star that David was. He's not going to be the physical marvel that Kerry is. He's not going to be that guy. And he figures, if I can't be what they want me to be, I'm not good enough as I am. And he goes and he kills himself. And this is an interesting framing of the Mike Von Erich story. And since I don't know that much about him, I'm very interested in what people who know a lot more about Mike Von Erich think of this version of Mike Von Erich. Because we know that Chris was the younger brother who was really interested in being a wrestler, who really wanted to be a wrestler, but physically he was too small and he had genetic deficiencies that was not going to make that happen. But what you see is, again, Fritz is imposing wrestling upon everybody. Kevin seems to be the most into it. Kerry almost got out of it because he was into sports, which is what Fritz loves. Fritz loves sports. And that goes into, I guess, the Kerry story we could talk about. At the beginning of the movie, you see that they show immediately three things. They show a Christian cross, they show guns, and they show sports trophies. So that tells you right there, those are the three most important things in the Von Erich household. God, guns, sports. All right. So throughout the movie, you get a sense that, and guns, by the way, just means masculinity. It's just basically masculine culture. You could say sports is basically like brotherhood, being a team or whatever. So you can look at these things literally. You can also look at them symbolically. So earlier in the movie, you get a sense of religion when it comes to the mom, where every time she tries to push back on Fritz and Fritz overwhelms her, she basically starts praying and separating herself and saying, we're going to leave it to God. Sports, of course, is wrestling. Also, Fritz played football. You don't see that in the movie, but he talks about it. And then you got Carrie, and Carrie is not in the movie a lot. In the early part of the movie, Carrie is in college, and he's about to join the Olympics, the discus throw. Then you get the old Von Erich luck, or the curse, as they called it, where Jimmy Carter boycotts the Olympics, and Carrie now can't go and win a gold medal in the Olympics. So now, he's about to get pushed into wrestling. So that's essentially what happens. And you see that Carrie is the bad boy. He's the one that does steroids. He's the one taking painkillers. He's the one drinking and partying and everything. And then you see basically Carrie dissolve. Even though he was the golden boy and literally became the world champion, he went out drunk driving on his motorcycle and lost his foot. He starts taking painkillers. His behavior starts to change. He becomes erratic. He becomes angry. They did a good job with his characterization. The only problem I had with it was they toned it down so much. Carrie Von Erich got arrested quite a few times, and I think him getting arrested largely led to his suicide. But they didn't go into him getting arrested. They basically just said, well, he was losing everything. He had lost his family. He was losing his WWF job, and now he was, just in a bad space and went to kill himself. I think part of it, it's not 100% untrue that all those things occurred at around the same time. But embarrassing his father by getting arrested by having drugs on him is an important element to the Von Erich character. Because a lot of these guys, when they killed themselves, it was because they were afraid of tarnishing the family name or making the family look bad. That's why they did it, to escape shame. It wasn't just internal pressures. It was also the external pressure from Fritz. It was a combination of my life's in shambles. For Mike, he was physically in shambles. His shoulder was bad. His brain screwed up because he had 107 temperature. He was never going to be the person that he was before. And he certainly can't be what everybody wants him to be. So it's internal pressure and external pressure to the point where he saw death as the only release. Same thing with Carrie, where there was the internal pressure of losing his foot, being in pain, the external pressure of losing his family, and not wanting to embarrass his father. His behavior is out of control. He's getting arrested. And the only way he could see to get away from this is to kill himself. If you would have showed both, I think it would have been best. They showed that when it comes to Mike. They showed the pressure that Fritz was putting on him to get back into the ring, also to be a wrestler in the first place, and to get back into the ring. And then you could physically see that he was never going to get any better because of the way he was speaking. They did a good job of maintaining that he speaks very slowly and he has a very dull look to his face. And then when he goes off and he kills himself, you're like, man, that kid was in really bad shape. When it comes to Carrie, you felt bad for him because you see that he's deeply into drugs and alcohol. But because you're not shown how much time is going by, we don't know how deep he was in, So that was just one miss, But I think they did a good job with Carrie in terms of the characterization, in terms of toning things down, not to embarrass his family too much about, with the excessive arrests and stuff like that. Of course, he has children that are still alive, even though you don't see them in the movie. So you have to take that into account as well. They wanted to make sure that he was not going to be too embarrassed because his children have to see that. So I understand. So let's talk about Fritz. We've talked about Fritz a lot, and you actually see a lot of the Fritz character and how he reacts to other people. At the very beginning of the movie, Fritz is a wrestler. He spends more money than they have on a trailer or something to that effect because he truly believes he's going to be world heavyweight champion. Fritz Von Erich in this movie is shown as a man who has a victim complex. In the scene where he basically tells Carrie it's time for you to go into wrestling. He has a conversation with him in which he says, the world keeps taking from us. It's time that we start taking things back, or to something to that degree. And even though the conversation is supposed to be about why he wants Kerry to get into wrestling, the conversation is really about himself. That he feels that he should have been world champion, but the NWA would never give him the shot. They didn't believe in him. They kept taking stuff away from him. Just like Jimmy Carter took away your chance to become an Olympian, and that becomes the overall narrative of Fritz Von Erich, is that he's a guy who thinks that he should have been bigger than he really was. He has this complex where Kevin is calling it a curse. All these negative things happen, all these terrible things happen. It's the Von Erich curse. Fritz sees it as everybody's out to get us. We're being held down. We're being screwed over. How can these crazy things happen? And then the movie shows you that the Von Erich curse is in some way a real thing, because just as things are looking up, bad things happen. He's looking at Kevin. Kevin is doing great. He gets Kevin booked for Harley Race. Kevin gets injured in the match, and he finishes the match, but physically it's not looking like Kevin's going to be the guy. So now he's got to move on to David. He puts all his chips in on David. David becomes far more popular than anybody could have ever imagined, because he has promos and he has charisma. And then David goes off and dies in Japan. So as things go up, they come right back down. He finally gets the World Heavyweight Championship when Kerry Von Erich wins it, only to lose Kerry's foot. And of course, Kerry has to give up the title after he loses his foot. They don't go into too much detail about that. That's not how that occurred, but that's the overall narrative of the story. Is for every positive that the Von Erich family has, there's a tragedy that is attached to it. And they show that this is kind of how Fritz deals with it, is by saying the universe is out to get us, essentially. This sort of paranoia. But he's also very overbearing. Now, again, they do a good job of not having him be very blatantly abusive towards the boys. He is not unnecessarily verbally abusive. I've heard stories from Kevin about Fritz that were worse than what I saw from Fritz in this movie. He just seems to be living vicariously through his sons and forcing his vision onto them and trying to get them to reach his dreams instead of guiding them to have their own dreams and live their own dreams. And that's typically his number one flaw here. He is shown to have a lot of pride in his sons. He's shown to really love his boys, but he has very, very high standards for them. There's a scene where, him and Kerry have a thing, because Kerry is now in the WWF and he's the Intercontinental Champion. And, Fritz is very happy about that, but he says, when are they going to give you a championship match up there? Hellwig, he's nothing. He's got nothing on you. And Fritz gets a gun from Kerry because he bought him a gun. And this is where you get Kerry actually losing his mind because he's yelling at Fritz or whatever. So you get that he's proud of his boys, of their achievements, that other people see them as being incredibly talented, but he keeps raising the bar. It's never enough. It's never good enough. Like, you're the Intercontinental Champion on WWF. That's great. But when are you going to be the world champion? You're a big star here. That's great, but you're not the world champion. And it always has that sense of it's never enough. And living with that can be problematic, and it can be very stressful. And it was worse than that in real life. That's the one thing about it. I was worried as they were doing this movie if they were going to be somewhat historically accurate to Fritz. Because Fritz, he's one of the people who started this whole thing. This shit wouldn't have happened the way that it did if Fritz was a different person. Let's put it like that. But because he is who he is, the boys did what they did. That's why I say the internal pressures, the external pressures. There's always going to be internal pressures. There's always going to be injuries. There's always going to be divorces. There's always going to be you falling short. But if you have a support system, a strong support system, these kinds of things can be worked through. what it shows you when you look at the Von Erich story is they didn't really have a strong support system outside of each other. And then as they started dying off, it became much more of a problem. But Fritz wasn't there as a strong support system in tough times. He was there when times were good, but he wasn't really there when times were tough. And he also cared a lot about, sinning and you embarrassing the family. So yes, we probably could have talked and maybe hardened Fritz a little bit more, but overall, I think the characterization of Fritz was very good. Now let's just talk about like the general, how did the actors portray the characters? What did I think about that? So Harley Race was in this movie. The guy who played Harley Race was not awful. He was actually not too bad. He probably could have used a rougher voice, but I think from the look, he had a really good Harley Race look with the stomach, the barrel chest, that kind of thing. He looked like a guy who could play Harley Race. It wasn't that bad. Of course, Ric Flair was absolutely awful. Ric Flair was a young Rock levels of bad. He was awful. He lacked intensity. He lacked charisma. He lacked character. He looked shitty in that wig. Ric Flair, undoubtedly the worst part of the movie. Bruiser Brody was in this movie too. The guy who played Bruiser Brody in the movie was probably thicker around than Bruiser Brody is. I'm talking like heavier. He looked a little bit like him, but he probably was much bigger than Bruiser Brody ever was. Gino Hernandez was also in the movie, which is cool. I like that too. The actors who played the actual characters. So Zac Efron as Kevin Von Erich was jacked beyond belief. Probably more jacked than Kevin has ever been. If you've seen a picture of Kevin Von Erich, he was lean muscle. Kevin was the quick one, the striker. He was not the big jacked one. That was Kerry. Kerry was the jacked one. But in this movie, Jeremy Allen White, who played Kerry, is smaller than everybody else. He is much smaller than everybody else. He was embarrassingly small. That's the only problem I have with the portrayal of Kerry Von Erich, because that guy was entirely too small, man. He was not a believable Texas Tornado, not a believable Kerry Von Erich. And I think the muscular face that Zac Efron had, the chiseled face, the chiseled jaw and everything, would have fit Kerry so much better. But Jeremy Allen White as Kerry was not terrible. He just was not big enough. The guy who played David Von Erich was Harris Dickinson. He was good. He looked the part, sounded a little bit like David. You could actually hear that they modeled some of the dialogue off of David Von Erich promos, so that was pretty good. The guy who played Mike, his name is Stanley Simons. He has a chubby face. Mike Von Erich is skinny, very skinny. Even before he got sick, he was skinny. But the cherubic face of Stanley Simons, it benefited this version of Mike Von Erich because it showed you that Mike was the softer brother. So he had a softer look to him. Chubbier cheeks, rosier lips or whatever. He didn't look like a wrestler, which was the plan, which was the goal, because Mike is the guy who wanted to do music. He didn't want to be a wrestler. He didn't want to go to the gym and work out and be all tough and strong like his brothers. He didn't want to do that. He wanted to go and play in a garage band. So for that perspective, they were successful in making Mike look different physically to show that he is a different person than his brother. So that makes sense. But he is certainly chubbier in the face than Mike ever was. The guy who played Fritz Von Erich, Holt McCallany, is absolutely perfect. He, even to some degree, walked like Fritz. I mean, if I didn't know Fritz Von Erich, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two. He was fantastic. All right, he was really good. Holt McCallany was very good as Fritz. He was quite good. I thoroughly enjoyed his performance. Maura Tierney as the mom. Well, the mom was barely in it. The mom was so distant, and I don't know that much about the Von Erich mom. So, and the same thing when it comes to Kevin Von Erich's wife. She was an important part of the movie. She's not annoying or anything like that. She's just unimportant. She has to be there for, narrative purposes, but she's not really an important part of the movie, and she doesn't really detract either. So none of them really screw things up. But I was interested in the film, and I think the film did a very good job of being very emotional. I just think that they should have used time better and showed us as time is progressing and maybe brought some real life elements into it. There's quite a few things that they could have brought into the story that I think would have been useful. For instance, the murder of Gina Hernandez. Why not bring Gina Hernandez's murder into the movie? It would have been very useful for the story to show that they were pushing Gino Hernandez as a star and then he gets killed. I loved the recreation of 1970s Texas, the recreation of the sportatorium. It looked amazing, even with the smoky look to the arena. It was great. I loved that. Like the wrestling element was solid enough that it was passable. So Hollywood is getting really good at the wrestling element as more wrestlers are looking for Hollywood jobs and they're going into Hollywood and really training the actors on how to wrestle. So that stuff's starting to look pretty good, especially when you compare it to like the movie The Wrestler from a couple of years ago, maybe over a decade ago. The wrestling in these movies actually looks so much better and a lot more realistic. Now, it looked more like an actual match than it did back then, and those didn't look too bad, if we're being honest. So, I loved a lot of the elements of the movie. I thought the elements was really good. The guy who played Terry Gordy in the movie looked like Terry Gordy. For Christ's sake, where did they find that guy? That guy looked like Terry Gordy. But if you can overlook that Chris Von Erich is not in the movie, you will enjoy it. If you'll overlook that some of the more dramatic elements were removed without changing the nature of the characters too much because they're trying to tell a very specific story, then yes, this movie was really good. It's not a documentary. It's not going to tell you everything that you need to know, but in terms of being historically accurate, I think it's actually pretty historically accurate. Only problem is they don't show you that this stuff happens over a long period of time. Really long, like over a decade, from 1979 to 1993. Also, I felt like some of the major events could have used a scene or two to really lift them up. Most notably, when Kerry won the title, I think there was a scene missing where Fritz could finally give a hug, pat on the back, or something because the belt was finally in the family. I think you needed that scene in the movie just to show that the family had finally gotten what he wanted. What Fritz finally got what he wanted and how things were going to unravel from there. It's the same as, you have this guy and he wants to, I don't know, save the princess. Well, you have to show him saving the princess. Like you can't just be like, yes, princess saved. And then we move on to, we don't know what happens after that. It's like, well, no, it should have been Fritz watching the 3 count, tears in his eyes or whatever. But instead they had Carrie and Rick wrestling in the ring and mom is imagining David watching it from the stairs. That's fine. You still could have done that, but it would have been nice to see Fritz finally have his dream accomplished and then see it unravel. Also, when it comes to the motorcycle crash, you didn't get to see the actual crash. You see Kerry getting drunk. He gets up, he leaves, he goes, he gets on his motorcycle. He's sweating a lot. He's on the road. And then you see the next scene. He's waking up in the hospital and he walks to the room and he's only got 1 foot. He's on crutches. He only got 1 foot. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, the crash, the suffering that follows the crash, the destruction of his ankle, all of that stuff is probably necessary in the movie. And like, we got a scene of David jacking off in the shower. That wasn't important. What was important is Kerry destroying his ankle and ultimately losing his foot. That was important. All right. That was an important element of the movie that I think also should have been in it. But there was very few things where I kind of felt like, yeah, you probably should have put that in the movie. There was a scene of Bruiser Brody working through a match, like prearranging things. I'm pretty sure there's going to be a lot of wrestling historians are going to be like, Bruiser Brody pre-planning spots like he's Randy Savage. He wouldn't have done anything like that. Well, that's true, but come on. I'm gonna talk about this last scene really right here because it was incredibly touching. It was the one scene in the movie that nearly made me cry. After Carrie commits suicide, he leaves the note that he's going to go walk with his brothers. And you get the scene of Carrie and David and Mike in heaven. All right. They're meeting up in heaven. So then I believe it was David who says, "Where's Jackie?" And then you see little Jack Atkinson, and he's like 6. And because I think that's how old he was when he died. I think he was like 6 or 7. And that that made me tear up because they introduced themselves to him and they hug him and they all hugging each other. And I was like, oh my God, that was such an intense moment. And then because I am the asshole that I am, and I was like, you in heaven after committed suicide? Like, wait a minute, there's 4 of you up there. 2 of you committed suicide. I don't think so. I don't know about that. Suicide's in heaven. I'm not sure that's going to happen. But as a moment, it was very, very touching. Choked me up. I was very. I was destroyed seeing Little Jack because he wasn't in the movie at all up to that point. He had only been mentioned once in the entire film. So it was very sweet that the Vine Eric boys, they meet up in heaven and they're all kind of like, you get the idea that they're waiting on Kevin. And then you see Kevin and he's watching his sons play football and he just bursts into tears. And this is when you get the classic Kevin Vine Eric line that my whole life I've been a big brother. Now I'm not even a brother. When it comes to the heartstrings, man, that one did it. That was tough. And I remember when he said that, and that was one of those things where you're like, man, I don't see how he's still walking the earth. And it shows you the power of Kevin Vine Eric as a person, that he thinks that, and knows all of his brothers are dead. And, from little Jackie to David to Kevin to Carrie to Mike. And of course, we're talking about real Kevin. So we're talking about Chris as well. And the horror that his family has gone through. And to have that mentality that not only were you alive when your big brother died, but you've watched all of your little brothers die too. You've been a big brother your whole life. And now you're not even a brother. As a big brother, and I've been a big brother my whole life, even though I don't always agree with my baby brother, I couldn't imagine waking up one day and those 2 guys are not on this planet anymore. I wouldn't know what to think. I wouldn't know what to do. So my eternal sympathy to real life Kevin Vine Eric. The movie was really good. I know it was done with respect because the Vine Erics have suffered enough, for Christ's sake. At least the movie was good. Would have hated to disrespect them and disrespect the legacy of the family and everything. So some of the artistic decisions was done clearly out of respect for not showing like the drug arrests and, copious amounts of alcohol and steroids or whatever that Carrie was doing, not showing the terror that he went through, losing his foot, some of the other stuff that he had going on. It was all done out of respect. So I'm fine with that. Otherwise, movie was really good. Let me know what you guys thought, and I'll talk to you guys later.
Tell me what's worse than learning all that you led to believe was all horse crap. They distort so